gangster now.
The drive-by shooting becomes the centerpiece of gangster recrimination. Its lethal power helps make Al Capone the biggest crime boss in Chicago. By 1926, he controls the majority of Chicago's vice trade on the south and west side of town, as well as the suburb of Cicero. But the gangland war escalates when Capone's arch enemy, Northsider Jaime Weiss, makes a bold strike at Capone on his own turf.
Jaime Weiss was referred to as the only gangster Al Capone ever really feared. Capone was heard to say once that if he had known what he was getting into when he left New York, he'd have never set foot in Chicago.
September 20th, 1926. Capone is dining in his Cicero headquarters at the Hawthorne Hotel when he hears a burst of Tommy gun fire on the street. When Capone thinks the attack is over, he goes to the window to see what's happening. And that's exactly what Weiss is waiting for. You're watching Man, Moment, Machine on the History Channel. September 20th, 1926. Al Capone hears Tommy gun fire outside his headquarters at the Hawthorne Hotel. As he goes to the window to look, the real assault begins. Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran lead a motorcade of up to 10 cars that systematically strafe the hotel with shotgun and Tommy gun fire.
I think it'd be fair to say that in the drive-by shooting at the Hawthorne Hotel, they shot the hell out of him. It must have been pretty frightening if you had 8 or 10 cars of guys armed to the teeth with shotguns, much less Thompson submachine guns.
The gunmen fire approximately 1,000 rounds. Miraculously, Capone emerges unscathed.
When Capone is fired on like that in broad daylight in an attack that demolishes that whole block, Capone's ultimate reaction is, this guy will stop at nothing to get me.
This act of aggression is a critical link in the chain of events that leads to Capone's ultimate revenge. It not only seals the fate of the Northside Gang and their leader, Jaime Weiss, but it also triggers an escalation of violence that even Capone himself is hoping to avoid.
Capone had always wanted peace. During the struggle with Jaime Weiss, Capone's actions were largely defensive. He was protecting himself from Weiss, not so much as trying to put Weiss away.
Jaime Weiss is a fierce opponent, intelligent, fearless, and brutal. He will not rest until Capone is dead.
The attack at the Hawthorne Hotel confirmed that the only way to stop the bloodshed and bring back some semblance of cooperation and prosperity like the former years would be to have to put Jaime Weiss out of the way.
I need you to take care of Jaime Weiss. This has gone on long enough!
Take care of it, boss. We'll handle it, boss.
October 11th, 1926. As Jaime Weiss arrives at his Northside headquarters, Capone gunmen lie in wait. The Northside Gang has lost another leader, and Capone's longtime rival is gone. With Weiss out of the way, Capone decides it's time to end the bloodshed. He calls for a general truce among all the Chicago gangs.
I think it's fair to say Capone was diplomatic, as gangsters go. Look, there's enough here for everybody. All we need to do is just, stay in our separate corners, if you will, and get along. Why ruin a good thing by trying to kill each other?
Capone also embarks on a public relations campaign meant to improve his image. He takes his son to baseball games, and later opens a soup kitchen for the unemployed.
He skillfully cultivated his Robin Hood persona, that he was actually stealing from the rich or from somebody to give to the poor. He liked to portray himself as the ally of the working man.
But Capone's problems with the North Side gang are far from over. With Weiss gone, Bugs Moran assumes leadership, and his hatred for Capone remains unabated. No truce will stop Moran on his quest for revenge.
Capone was responsible for most of the major losses that occurred for Moran personally and professionally. There was no way that there could ever be a personal peace between the two of them.
That's it.
Over the next 2 years, Moran launches a series of attacks meant to kill Capone and his closest people.
I suspect with Capone, there's just only so much he'll take, and enough is enough. If these guys, can't cooperate with me, then we'll try something different.
Got a couple of guys down in St. Louis. Can make a call.
And Capone had realized that the only way to combat the problem was to remove it entirely.
I want Moran.
In December of 1928, Capone retreats to Florida, leaving his best men in Chicago to oversee his plan. In February of 1929, Capone's spies discover that Moran is planning to meet with his top lieutenants at a low-profile garage at 2122 North Clark Street. February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Capone lookouts watch the garage for Moran's arrival. The last to enter is a stocky gangster wearing a dark overcoat and tan fedora, Moran's winter uniform. The lookout makes a critical misjudgment and calls the waiting gunman.
Moran's in. You're on. Go.
With Moran believed to be in the garage, Capone's men move in. But their perfect plan is already unraveling. You're watching Man, Moment, Machine on the History Channel. February 14th, 1929, St. Valentine's Day. 7 gangsters are called to an important meeting in an out-of-the-way garage on the north side of Chicago. They're expecting their leader, George Bugs Moran, to arrive.
Moran's in. You're on. Go.
Instead, they're about to encounter the fury of a longtime enemy. The man, Al Capone, is lying low in Florida as his men in Chicago carry out a deadly vendetta. The moment is approaching when Capone will attempt to eliminate his primary rival. The machine is the Thompson submachine gun, the only weapon of its day powerful enough to make the kind of statement Capone wants.
How about you? You in? I'm in. All right.
The plan is fairly simple. You got to get at these guys who are going to have lookouts and who are obviously by their nature very, very suspicious. So, the basics of the plan are you make it look like a police raid.
All right, you guys. Against the wall. Now, against the wall. Show it right.
It looks like a routine bootlegger bust, but these so-called cops are imposters brought in by the Capone gang. What the gunmen don't realize, though, is that Bugs Moran is not with his men in the garage. The wheels are in motion for a bloodbath, and nothing can stop it now. Capone's hitmen make their entrance.
one of you bums is Moran?
Within 10 seconds, all but one of Moran's men are lifeless on the floor. The killers exit in a dramatic ploy meant to confuse witnesses. The fake officers march the plainclothesmen out to the car as if making an arrest. The entire attack takes less than 15 minutes.
This was a very professional job. The speed of execution and the daring ruse of dressing the gunmen as cops was breathtaking. It raised the art of assassination in Chicago to a new level.
Bugs Moran arrives just in time to see the killers getting into their police car.
Moran was 10 to 15 minutes late arriving at the garage because he stopped at the hotel where he resided, went into the barber shop, and had a haircut.
When the real police arrive, they find 7 bodies lying in pools of blood.
The victims would have been absolutely bullet-riddled, and an enormous amount of overkill was used against these crime victims, and the result had to have been a scene of complete and total gore.
But one of Moran's men, Frank Gusenberg, is still moving.
Who did this to you? Who shot you?
Nobody shot me, cop.
The lone survivor, obeying the gangster code of silence to the very end, never cooperates with the police. Gusenberg dies a few hours later.
The job went down, boss.
All right.
But I gotta tell you, Moran wasn't even in the building.
What?
Capone was supposedly upset that somebody had screwed up and said that Moran was there when he wasn't, and therefore they missed the intended target.
The killings make headlines across the nation and turn Al Capone into a household name. They also spark a movement against gangland violence.
The public outcry over the violence of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre for the first time got the federal government involved.
On October 18, 1931, almost 2 years after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Capone is convicted of the only crime authorities can pin on him: tax evasion. He's sentenced to 11 years and $80,000 in fines and sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The rivalry and bloodshed between the North Side and South Side gangs comes at a heavy cost.
Nobody really won. Moran lost his key lieutenants in the Clark Street garage, and the aftermath resulted in Capone ultimately losing his freedom.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre turns public opinion against Prohibition, confirming what most people believe, that outlawing alcohol has caused more problems than it's solved. 4 years later, on December 5th, 1933, Prohibition is repealed. In 1934, 3 years into his sentence, authorities stage a public relations coup by transferring Capone to a newly opened maximum security federal prison called Alcatraz. That same year, the National Firearms Act makes it illegal for civilians to own a Thompson submachine gun without a strict registration process.
Its use and the use of other automatic weapons was addressed by the first major piece of national firearms legislation, and that law is still in force today.
In 1939, nearly 20 years after its introduction, the Thompson submachine gun is finally enlisted for the job it was intended, on the battlefields of World War II.
There were still so many Thompsons that had been produced that the weapon is around and is a part of every battle and every theater where American forces fought.
Because of failing health, Capone serves only 8 years of his sentence and is released from prison in 1939. the once feared mob boss, retires to Miami, Florida. On January 25, 1947, 48-year-old Al Capone dies quietly in his bed of complications from syphilis. The gang that he built into a powerhouse in the 1920s still operates on a smaller scale in Chicago today.
Although Capone didn't wield the machine gun himself in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, because of the violence in the Prohibition era, for which he was largely responsible, he became associated with it for the rest of time.
When Al Capone extracts his vengeance with a Thompson submachine gun, it's a bloody moment of gangland recrimination that is etched forever in American history. It's also an example of the M3 factor, the convergence of a powerful man with a powerful machine that creates a force for righteousness, or in this case, evil. We'll continue to follow this force throughout history on Man, Moment, Machine.